couple of hands up. Ross, I think, was first, and then Derek.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. Both talks really fantastic. So thanks very much for that. I just wanted to follow up with David about the nuclear-powered submarine accidents. Can you say a little bit about the history and the experience we have now from previous accidents of nuclear-powered submarines?
Well, one of the issues that we'll face in Australia is the secrecy that comes with militarisation. For instance, in the UK, their government has declined to make public nuclear submarine incidents since 2017. So there isn't any more recent information in the UK about those issues. Nuclear submarine ports in the UK are contaminated zones. The waters around there are contaminated from radiation release from the subs, particularly nuclear reactor coolant release. That'll be an issue to some extent in Australia, where there are stores to be set up. Now, one licensed at Stirling, for instance, one intended for Port Adelaide at Osborne, and there would be one required for an East Coast nuclear submarine base, whether that's at Port Kembla, who may be the only people in Australia so far who can defend themselves from AUKUS, or somewhere else on the East Coast. So that Australia will accrue maintenance waste from US and UK submarines. So it's not true when Minister Dutton, when Minister Miles says that we won't take international waste. We already plan to, in addition to what Dave referred to in the bill. The US lost 2 nuclear submarines at sea. They say that they understand the reactors weren't at fault in the loss of those submarines, but they were lost at sea, and all crews were lost in each case. The submarines sank to depth and haven't been recovered. The US says they monitor around the submarines. They say there's limited radiation release. So we don't know, we can't confirm whether the reactors were the cause of those losses of the submarines and full crews at sea. So I'm not confident that there is a public reliable database to know the extent of the incidents that have been caused by nuclear submarines so far. There's obviously an extensive malpractice in the Russian system around nuclear submarines and pollution and disposal and dumping of radioactive material from the subs. There was an incident where a British nuclear-powered submarine collided with a French nuclear submarine in the ocean, both saying that their stealthy characteristics meant that they couldn't tell the other one was there. It doesn't say the best about their direction finding and knowledge that they could run into each other in that way, as to what else they may run into over time. The US says that it's a 1 in a million chance that they could have a nuclear submarine reactor accident to the scale that's envisaged in Australia, called the reference accident, a core meltdown of the reactor on board. That's, it's a projection. Probabilities are largely made up and don't reflect real world circumstance, but if it's 1 in a million per year per reactor and a naval reactor, and they have over 100 between the so-called allied countries, the AUKUS partners, and you run them for decades, then you start to get into real figures. And now it's true, it's more likely that a submarine nuclear reactor accident would occur at sea, but it could well be in a port. It may be more likely in a US port, but the reason it could happen in an Australian port is that federal Labor are imposing their presence, those nuclear reactor presidents, in our ports. Thanks.
Annette, my turn? Oh, I'll go ahead. Either David Noonan or David Sweeney can answer this. What have the US and UK done with decommissioned submarines? I know Britain has old nuclear subs rusting away in Plymouth. Since 1986, the US has disposed of apparently 142 reactor compartment packages. They do this in Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. They apparently store nuclear materials in the Pacific Northwest, wherever that is. Could you possibly add to that?
Look, we can probably do some of that. The UK has so far not been able to properly fully decommission a single nuclear-powered submarine. They intend to, but they haven't got that far, and they've had to put back their schedules to be able to try and do so repeatedly. The UK has no idea where the high-level nuclear waste from the subs will end up. They say they may have a site within a number of decades, but they're largely dependent on the failure of the civilian nuclear industry in the UK to find a site for its own waste. In the US, they take the nuclear fuel out of the submarine and it goes to laboratories run by the federal government there. It's stored in casks, and they then take the reactor undisassembled and they put them in shallow trenches. And there are visuals of long rows of US Navy reactors in shallow trenches in the USA, and they've know for that what is largely intermediate level waste in terms of the physical structure of the reactor itself, where the metals have become radioactive over time in proximity with the neutron flux. They've know expected disposal means for those reactors, either for the reactors themselves or for the high level waste from the remaining fuels.
Thanks.
So largely they've had over 60 years and they don't know, yet Australia has taken on the responsibility that we will do this in Australia with US origin Virginia class subwaste. We'll take that responsibility up within a few years.
Thanks, David. Francis.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting talks, David and Dave. Dave, I was just wondering, to be a nuclear-free advocate, I was hearing, I'd like to hear your thoughts on a report that was in the news today about Australia won't reach its target for climate renewal, whatever, without the cooperation of the regions. And I know here where I am sitting in a city, and they're not going to build a kind of a wind farm at the back here. But I'm just wondering how you feel about the transition to renewables. It's been obviously, as you say, successful. But what do you think about the cooperation of the regions and how we might get them, other people living out there, especially farmers, on board with sites for new renewable infrastructure and that sort of thing? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. It's a really good question, and it is a real challenge. Like there's no energy source that's without cost or consequence. I think that's important to say. So what you try and do is minimise the cost, and that's across the entire definition of cost, not just financial, but environmental and the wider footprint, and maximise the benefits. So the challenge that we have in the renewable transition is not for it to be seen as an individualistic scramble for a new sort of California gold rush. Let's get there and carve little patches of renewable lands. We need to have a more systematic approach that protects areas of high conservation and cultural value. We need to have an approach that minimises its footprint, that tries to have shared and mutual benefit. And there's lots of examples of really quite clever placement of solar panels and the like on sort of reasonably marginal agricultural land, which means that there can be mixed uses. We hear a lot of hostility about renewable from regional Australia, like that's sort of talked up a lot. What we don't hear, though, is there are many, many success stories and many, many positive stories where First Nations people have been front and centre and driving this, where farmers speak with real gratitude and optimism about the security of base income from hosting renewables. So what we need to do is accept that renewables are the way forward for this country. And then the challenge is to move away from demonisation and into responsible management, and into good processes for siting, and into good processes for community consent and community benefit, and to actually make this work in a responsible and sustainable way. We cannot assume, Francis and all, that social license isn't needed and mustn't be earned and mustn't be routinely reinforced and re-won through good practice. So we don't need cowboys in renewables. We don't need backpackers in wicked vans being paid next to nothing. We need, as Annette said, skilled union labour. We need good processes. We need to prioritise protection of high conservation and cultural areas and maximise the most amount of benefit. That's a challenge enough. Doing that is a challenge enough. We don't need extra distractions like whales being turned into sushi by offshore wind. That just is not true. It's not credible, and it's deeply unhelpful. And so we're at a point now where we need to make decisions that keep the lights on and the alarms off. And the best way to do that is with sensible, considered, sustainable but speedy rollout of renewables.
Yeah, well said. Other questions? I mean, I suppose what I'm sort of really thinking about is, I think you brought up, Dave, the how effective the referendum for the voice was undone. Basically, popular support was undone through a very cleverly put together social media campaign, and using, and I use the word using deliberately, a couple of, particularly two Aboriginal people, to create doubt and division in people's minds. So, you know, I think for the progressive movements, for people who want to have a sustainable and clean and peaceful future, we've got to really be thinking, how do we manage this resource that, you know, the wealthy far-right movement really in this country has got at their fingertips. And
I think that's a real. I think you're absolutely right, and I think for a lot of us, just the extent of how that voice polling 3 months out was 65% of the country supportive of what was a very modest proposal, and then it failed the popular vote in every jurisdiction except the ACT, and that was a shock, and it was considered, and much of it was either malicious or racist. Some of it was complexities of with people saying this isn't good enough, so I'm not supporting it, or this is giving away sovereignty, so I'm not supporting it. But that was a small proportion of that vote that voted no. The majority was taken in by that line of, if you don't know, vote no. Well, actually, you know, I think we come from a culture that says if you don't know, find out. But also, like, if you don't know what sort of reactors, if you don't know where and how many they're going to be sorted, the water, who pays the insurance, who's going to run them, if you don't know what proportion of the grid, that's a lot of things we don't know, so vote no. But I think it's really, a couple of things are really important, I think now. One is that what comes through in all the polling, no matter how sophisticated things are and all that sort of stuff, is people trust people that they know. So all of us know people, and we are the messengers of saying, yeah, I can see the point. It would be great if there was a silver bullet, but there's not. And steady, speedy renewables is the way to go. I think we also need to convey to people in our community, in our networks, in our family and all of that, that nothing has fundamentally changed with nuclear. For many of us, we've grown up with this stuff and we know waste and uncertainty and Fukushima and Chernobyl and weapons and all of that. Others don't, and they think it's bright, new and shiny. There's nothing bright, new, shiny. Small modular reactors are not in commercial deployment anywhere in the world. And you can put any amount of spin out, but there's not one cold beer, not one hot shower anywhere in the world from a commercially deployed small modular reactor. So, you know, I'm a big fan of enthusiasm, but it's not a good basis for a national energy strategy. So small modular reactors don't exist. And the reactors that do exist bring with them unique and unresolved problems of safety, security, linkage to dual-use technology, military, waste problems. And even if you don't really care about that, or even if you don't really accept that, they are the slowest and the most expensive form of new energy generation in Australia. So when we've got the wind and the sun and so many other options, when we, you know, are clearly on the move, like it seems absurd now to think that it wasn't that long ago that Scott Morrison said that EVs will wreck your weekend, they'll kill your weekend. And now just have a look on the roads at EVs or hybrids. Like people see this is happening. It's the nuclear stuff is hypothetical and in 20 years it might kick in. The renewable stuff is growing rapidly and happening now and powering real lives in the real world. So we need to just ground people that there's no nuclear silver bullet, that there's actually a clear pathway forward, and that's what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got one question from Eileen, but I think after that we probably will wrap up. That's an hour and a half. We've had people at this meeting, and that's probably long enough. Eileen.
Okay, I'll make it quick. I mean, I'm very cynical, but I think that this distraction that the LNP keep throwing at everything, it's because they're in the grip of the fossil fuel companies, and we're fighting this powerful corporations who obviously don't want to lose all their profits. And the argument is, of course, by politicians that it's the economy that we're protecting, and they're not protecting the planet.
Absolutely. I'd like to give the last word to David, if you wouldn't mind, David, if you've got any wrap-up comments.
Well, I suppose it's seen in the bigger picture, it's an existential fight for democracy and for community right to know and for community rights and interests. You know, there's a lot of particulars, a lot of technological issues, a lot of military strategy, nuclear aspects that you can delve into as far deep as you like. And, you know, the average person shouldn't have to do that. You know, I think we need to elevate the themes we're working on for communities' right to know and communities' right to decide their own future, and traditional owners' free, prior and informed consent. If you can work the issue up the theme ladder, and we might get broader public recognition of what's actually at stake. Thanks.
Thanks, David. There is a hand up. I can see Barbara's got a hand up. This will be the last hand. You're muted, Barbara. Do you want to speak?
Sorry, yep. Thanks, Annette. I'm sorry, but I just had to follow that up by, I'm looking at a document that Dave Sweeney circulated yesterday, some table document 6879 or something. And the attachment to consultation says there was consultation, and I've counted approximately 13 federal departments, no concerns identified. The Australian Submarine Agency consulted with state and territory governments, no concerns identified. No action is expected by any state or territory government to implement the agreement, and no public consultation has been undertaken because, ta-da, this is national security and we can't trust the regular people with the information. So it is a bit of an uphill battle. That's all I want to say.
I'd call that authoritarianism.
That's exactly what it is, Derek.
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll close off tonight, but